Good afternoon. This is Rob Bell, and you're watching Getting the Record Straight. It is 4:24, April 24th, Friday afternoon. Kind of laid back today. Seemed like nothing I was planning to do today kind of worked out. I had some assignments I had to complete, and none of my clients called me or returned my call. But that be that as it may, I decided to come on and do a video today, basically a follow up on the two previous videos where I had guests on the phone doing phone interviews. Um, my good friend um, Bill Walden, doing the music, talking about music, and Terry Johnson, and I just recently discussing some political things. And I wanted to follow up on those, both of those. So this is actually going to be a combined video. It won't be one that is just black rock and soul music or truth to power political analysis. Instead, it's going to be a little combination of both. I'll do a few minutes on the music and a few minutes on the politics. The first of all, stay safe. We're still dealing with this virus, despite what political leadership might suggest. You still have to be very cautious and do the social distancing and all the things that have been recommended that common sense dictates. That said, please subscribe if you're watching. I need to hear from you in terms of the subscriptions. We are moving along and doing better, so I appreciate that. As I said, this is kind of going to be a follow up or extension to both of the videos that were done in the past week or so. You may remember a couple videos back, I could not remember that phrase. Imitation is the greatest form of flattery. I couldn't remember flattery, but in fact that is the adage. Imitation is the greatest form of flattery, and it really speaks to part of why I do certainly the music end of getting the record straight, which, as I said, is called Black Rock and Soul. Um, and it is because I don't think enough acknowledgement, enough credit is given to the impact and pervasiveness of the black experience in music, the African American experience in music here in the United States as well as the world. It has definitely been the driving force behind the musical genres. Uh, Really, I've actually thought about this, but in the last 150 years, I don't think there's been anything culturally or artistically that can really compare with what's happened in terms of music, African American music here. I think we need to look at that more, but it's just been a dynamic development that just has no peer throughout the world. And what I want to do and try to do is to really demonstrate the impact that it's had and its centrality to the developments here in this country and again globally. I don't think that the presentation on the airwaves is adequate to tell the story of black music here in this country. And with that said, I did want to continue with a historical piece I was talking about a couple of shows ago. And we had talked about how black rock and roll or the African American experience as it relates to rock and roll had developed into the 60s, particularly in Detroit, Memphis, and in the South. I'm sorry, Chicago and Memphis, and with James Brown in the South. And we talked about Chicago, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Memphis and the Southern development, if you will. And in order to do that, you really have to start with Atlantic Records and their relationship with Stax, um, another record company which was based in Memphis. Of course, Atlantic Records, I believe, is based out of New York, and they had a tremendous influence on the music business and industry. They were founded by Ahmet Erdogan, and Jerry Wexler was a big part of Atlantic Records, and they just had a stellar cast of artists, and including Ray Charles, Earl Gardner, Dizzy Gillespie, Ruth Brown, and the Drifters. So their impact and significance in terms of jazz and African American music was extensive, and they formed an association with Stax Records in Memphis, and Jerry Wexler, who I mentioned before, was the one who really came up with the term rhythm and blues as a technical term on Billboard magazines to supplant race music, the term race music. But as I said, it really was a technical term, but the colloquial term, and what was being used in the country and on the streets was rock and roll. There were other terms, but that was the main one. At any rate, this association with Stax and their studio band just spawned a number of hits and a number of working with a number of great artists. The studio band at Stax was Booker T and the MGs and the Memphis Horns, and great cast of characters there, including Steve Cropper, Booker T, of course, and some of the artists that were promoted and developed with Stax and of course Atlantic were Otis Redding, the great Wilson Pickett, one of my favorites, as well as Sam and Dave, another great acts, and of course the writing group of Isaac Hayes and David Porter. They did most of the stuff for Sam and Dave, and of course Isaac would go on to great heights himself and to establish himself as an individual artist. But the Stax, Atlantic also worked with a studio band and studio house, if you will, in Alabama called Muscle Shoals. And that sound studio there, and their studio band was incredible. And they worked with Aretha Franklin, Percy Sledge, Boz Scaggs, Joe Cocker, the Staple Singers, just a tremendous array of artists. Of course, Atlantic is well known for its association with Aretha, and of course Percy Sledge. But so much was coming out of that area, Memphis and the South. That really iconic records, iconic artists, and so you had at least two areas that were geographical areas that were bringing new sounds, and not totally different from what was going on. It would become called rock, but certainly was more attuned to and attached to the gospel, jazz, and blues foundation that really characterized rhythm and blues and original rock and roll. So I want to stop there because after next show, or in the next couple of shows, I want to get into James Brown. I need to commit an entire segment to The Godfather, and after that, we'll talk about Motown. So let me stop there for a second, and then we want to get into some of the political things that have been talked about in the last video. Yeah, so for our Truth to Power segment, I wanted to do a little bit of an adjunct to what was discussed with my good friend Terry Johnson. I took kind of a pessimistic view to the idea that Black leadership, African American leadership in this country had been the vanguard in terms of progressive, revolutionary ideas, liberation ideas, here in this country, obviously we had Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and many others who were advancing the ideas of freedom and liberation. And my view, my pessimistic view, was that I just don't see that, African Americans in the United States, any leadership on the now or on the horizon that would, also be this vanguard to bring a more peaceful and human existence to this earth and in fact to this country. And I really do feel that way, given that we have now we have black leadership that is, there's not really a true left in terms of black leadership that's on the political stage that I can see. It's a muted kind of leadership. It's a neoliberal leadership, and neoliberalism really is an economic term. It doesn't talk. It's not really about your political views in terms of social development and social justice. It really is. It means liberalism for the capitalist class and for capital. That they want to take the restraints off of capital. That's what really neoliberalism is about. At some point, we'll talk a little more about that with someone who's more knowledgeable than I am. But at any rate, that's what you have, I think, in terms of black political leadership, is a kind of muted, standoffish, let's go along and get along kind of perspective and outlook. I know Terry said, well, who cares who is the vanguard, who leads the change? And I agree with him on that. It's not that important that an African American from the United States lead the charge. The problem is, without an effective African American left, a truly progressive African American left, there's a void there. And what seems to be moving into that void, and in fact is there now, is really this concept of American exceptionalism. And I think many African Americans have bought into that this notion that America can go anywhere and do whatever it wants, can commit crimes against humanity, which it has been doing on an ongoing basis. And because it's so big and strong, it can bully its way. No one will challenge it. That's been accepted far too often by the public, and I dare say even by African American leadership. And that's what's really problematic for me. When you add to that the fact that the media has absolutely turned over and is in the pocket of the rich, the super rich, and the military industrial complex. There's no challenging of the money that's spent on war and for military might. And it really hinders this country. And one would think that African American leadership would be at the forefront in terms of challenging that, considering all the needs that so many of our communities need and require. And but you don't really hear much. You don't hear anything really out of the mainstream African American political community. And I think that's really, really problematic. And I think that it's a hindrance to us. And I think it's going to, be a weight that is going to be very difficult for us to remove going forward. Again, given the extraordinary needs of in many of our communities that aren't being addressed. And on that note, I'm going to say take care and have a good weekend. And we'll get back to some of this in a few days. Thank you.